Hey guys, it's Casey, and today we're going to talk about the books I read in the month of July. So in the month of July, I read 10 books, and as far as ratings go, it was a really good month. I ended up with 1 2-star, 1 3-star, 4 4-stars, and 4 5-stars. So the first book I read in July was actually one that I read throughout most of June, but it managed to finish in July, and that would be The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub. So this book follows a 12-year-old named Jack who lives with his mother and learns that his mother is dying, presumably of cancer. And he also learns that he has the ability to kind of flip between our world and a world known as the Territories. And in the Territories, there is a queen of the land, and that queen looks basically exactly like Jack's mother, and she is also sick and dying. And Jack learns that there's an object known as the Talisman, that if he recovers that, he will be able to use it to save his mother as well as the queen of the Territories and kind of become the hero of that land. One of my main complaints was that I felt the pacing was weird. I felt like this was very episodic, like it went through different chunks of events throughout the story. This is set up with a very classic like hero's journey structure, so it's got that like trials in the middle of it, so I understood why it was kind of segmented like that, but I felt like we spent a lot of times on parts I didn't care about, and then the parts that I did find interesting we were kind of breezed through and not given enough attention. So overall I just was not connecting to the middle like 400 pages of this book because it's not short. I also felt like there wasn't enough emphasis on the Territories. We're told all about this world and how like interesting it is, but then we don't spend very much time there. Most of it is spent with Jack kind of trekking across the United States. I really felt like that was a missed opportunity, and every time we were there I just wanted to stay there for a little bit longer, and instead we flipped right back and I just kind of lost interest. I also felt like Jack did not read as a 12-year-old. There's a brief mention in here that, oh, well, his trials have aged him, but then there's no exploration of like how that worked, and it felt kind of cheap, and I just was like, this is not how a 12-year-old would react to any of these situations, and it just pulled me out of the story a lot, and overall this one was with 2 stars. So the next book I read, I listened to the audiobook for, and that was Summer Nights by Jim Butcher. So Summer Nights is the 4th book to the Dresden Files series, which follows Wizard for Hire Harry Dresden as he works as a private investigator and a consultant to the Chicago Police Department to help solve all manner of supernatural crimes. As this is the 4th in the series, I can't say a lot about the plot of this one, but I can kind of give you just my overall impressions. So overall, Summer Nights follows the fallout from the end of the 3rd book, and it expanded the world in a really interesting way. I found that I wanted to know more about the greater like magical community and supernatural community of the Never Never, and I definitely want to know about the broader implications of events that are happening to Harry Dresden. So this was my favorite of the Dresden Files books so far. It was a lot more intricate than the other ones, and I really enjoyed that. I do want to say that Harry Dresden himself is still kind of getting on my nerves, but everything that's going on around him is just so interesting that I want to keep reading. So I also read another Dresden Files book this month, so I'm just gonna go ahead and tack it on here, even though I read it later in the month, and that would be the 5th book, which is Death Masks. So I also ended up giving this one 4 stars, just like Summer Nights. This one was a little bit different. While Summer Nights was pretty solid all throughout, I felt like the first half of Death Masks was pretty weak compared to some of the other things. I wasn't as sucked into the story, and I was just kind of like listening to it. It was fun to have on, but I wasn't totally engaged. But then the second half was so fun, and I loved it so much, and there were so many just kick-ass moments that I ended up rounding it up to 4 stars anyway. So the next thing I read was Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds, and I gave this 5 stars. So I listened to this as an audiobook, and it is an incredible audiobook. So this is a story that is written in verse, and it is about a boy named Will whose brother is shot and killed. And Will decides that he is going to avenge his brother, so he grabs a gun and he heads out of his apartment building and down the elevator. And this entire story takes place on that elevator ride. At each stop, Will is visited by somebody in his past that has a lesson to teach him. So I don't want to say too much more about the plot of this one because the audiobook itself was only like an hour and 45 minutes long, but what this book managed to accomplish in under 2 hours was such an emotional journey. It was so incredible, and just for it being able to bring up all these feelings and emotions for me in such a short period of time, I gave it 5 stars. It was awesome. Then I read Middle Game by Shauna Maguire. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. So this follows twins Roger and Dodger, who have been created by an alchemist who wants to use them to unlock the impossible city. So after Roger and Dodger are created, they are placed in separate families, but they discover that they can talk to each other telepathically. Roger has always been incredibly good with words, whereas Dodger has a knack for numbers. And this book follows their relationship with each other as they grow up and their development of their abilities and the things that come with that. The plot is really weird to summarize because if you give many more details than that, it gets into spoilers, and it's a very weird book, but I enjoyed it a lot. One of my favorite parts of this book was the sibling dynamic between Roger and Dodger. I really enjoyed that. The story was also very fast-paced, and it kept me sucked into the world pretty much the whole time. There were times in this book where I was kind of confused about what was going on. Like I said, the plot was kind of weird and at times kind of abstract, but I was never so confused that I wasn't enjoying what I was reading. Originally, I wanted to give this a 5 stars because when I ended this book, I was blown away by what it did and it was so cool. But then I ended up lowering it after a week because it didn't stick with me the way that I expected it to, and I lowered it to 4 stars, but I would still absolutely recommend this book. I loved it and it was so good. The next book I read was an ebook of the novella All Systems Read by Martha Wells. This is the first in the Murderbot Diaries. So I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. This follows an android that calls itself Murderbot. So Murderbot has managed to hack its governor module that controls all of its actions, and so it is essentially a free agent and able to do whatever it wants. And what it wants is to sit around and watch television all day and be left alone. But of course no one can find out that it's turned off its governor module because then it will be shut down. So this book follows Murderbot as it goes on a job with a group of scientists and begins to discover the mystery around that job and more of who it is. So the strongest part about this story was Murderbot itself. I thought it was a very interesting character, and I really liked reading about Murderbot a lot, but I wasn't able to connect with the humans that it was working with. I felt like there was a lot of dynamics within them that were mentioned, and I just didn't care and I didn't connect to any of them, and I just wanted to know more about what was going on with Murderbot's internal dialogue. It could be that it was just too short of a story for me to connect with some of the characters, but overall I think that kind of detracted from my enjoyment. That being said, I really like the way it's set up for future entries into the series, and I will definitely be continuing on because I do want to know more about Murderbot and I want to follow its adventures. So the 7th book I read in the month of July was Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. So this book follows the city of Elantris, which 10 years ago used to be filled with these individuals who had magical powers that made them essentially gods or demigods. Now these powers would be distributed across the population. You would just wake up one morning and have these magical powers and you would go to live in Elantris. Now 10 years ago, a magical plague struck and it turned everyone who had those powers into these walking dead. They weren't able to heal, but they also never died. So now when you wake up with those powers, instead you are kind of quarantined into the city of Elantris. So this book is set primarily in a city that is sprung out outside of the ruins of Elantris and follows 3 main perspectives. One of those perspectives was the prince of this city who woke up with this magical plague and is put into Elantris. The second perspective is a princess who was on her way to marry that prince and is now found herself widowed and the princess of a land she doesn't know. And the third follows a foreign priest as he tries to convert the citizens of this city. So this book was slower than I was expecting to, and it was intensely political. There was a lot more intrigue and scheming that was going on than I was expecting from this book. But I actually really enjoyed it, and I'm finding that I very much like slow-moving political fantasies, so this ended up being right up an alley I didn't know I had. I felt like each perspective was also interesting. Sometimes in multi-perspective books, I find myself like flipping to the end of a chapter and being like, how many more pages do I have to be in this person's head? But I really liked every one of the perspectives in this. None of them felt like the boring person to read from. And overall, I thought the setup for this was very unique and the ending paid off. So this is Brandon Sanderson's first novel, and I've heard a lot of people say that it's one of his weakest, and if this is his weakest, I am in for such a ride with the rest of Brandon Sanderson's book because I loved this and gave it 5 stars, and if the other ones are even better, I'm excited. So the next book I read was You Dream of Terra 2 by Temi O, and I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. So this is a young adult sci-fi book that follows 6 individuals that are selected to go and colonize this new planet known as Terra 2 to help kind of further the destiny of humanity. And based on that premise, I expected this to be a little bit more of a hard sci-fi book, but instead this read more as a contemporary set in space. The main focus of this was on the relationships between the characters and the characters' own internal struggles, especially with their decision to leave Earth and their family to go on this 20-something long year journey to eventually land on Terra 2 and only be surrounded by these 5 other people for the rest of their lives. So this book was very unexpected for me. Like I said, this wasn't what I was thinking I was getting going into it, but I loved it all the more for that. One of my favorite aspects was reading about how they each dealt with their decision to leave Earth behind differently. So this was a lot harder to read than I was expecting. There are some content warnings for depression, suicide, self-harm, but generally speaking, I really enjoyed most, if not all, of the characters in this, and I thought it was a very interesting exploration of this idea. One of my only complaints was that there was one or two characters that I wasn't as attached to, and also the pacing at the end felt a little bit rushed. I felt like we had taken a lot of time to get there, and then it just kind of rushed through some action at the end, and it was over. But otherwise, I really loved this book, and I recommend you pick it up. So the next book I read in July, and my favorite book that I read in July, was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. Easiest 5 stars I handed out. So good. So The Poppy War is a grimdark fantasy book that follows Rin as she works to get into this prestigious military academy. Once she's there, she finds that she's often discriminated against for being a darker-skinned woman from the southern region of the country. So the first part of this book is set in this sort of academy environment, and then eventually it shifts and is a story about war. This book was incredible, and based on other reviews I'd heard of it, this had more magic in it than I thought it was going to, and the magic system was really, really interesting. It was based a lot in like shaman magic and things like that, and I can't say too much more about the magic system without getting into spoilers, but I definitely thought that was one of the strengths of this book. I do want to say that this is a hard read. This book is one of the most graphic depictions of violence and warfare that I have ever read. There was a point in this book, and if you've read it, you probably know which one, that I felt physically ill reading about the things that happened, but I also felt like it was a very raw and real depiction of what war would look like. I think that's one of the things that makes this different than a lot of other fantasy series, is that it actually focuses on the ramifications of war and doesn't just glorify it as like a battle or a plot device, but instead it focuses on how difficult and traumatic and horrendous this would really be. I also thought that the cast of characters that we followed were very interesting, and I felt like there was a lot to explore within that and a lot of different dynamics that occurred, and I think that these are going to expand even more later in the series. At about probably the 45% mark, there was a split between part 1 and part 2 of the book that I thought was brilliant. Now I know some people say it's really jarring, but I thought it was just the smartest thing this book did, was a complete sort of tonal shift. I thought this book was brilliant, I thought it was incredible, I've already bought The Dragon Republic, I can't wait for The Burning God to come out. I'm so excited to finish off this series, and this is probably one of my favorite books I've read this year, hands down. So the last book I read this month was Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. So Royal Assassin is the second book in the Farseer trilogy, which is one of the trilogies in Robin Hobb's greater realm of the Elderling series. So I gave this one 4.5, maybe 5 stars. I genuinely can't decide. Even as I'm filming this on Goodreads, the rating is still blank because I can't decide if I want to give it 4 or 5 stars. So I've talked about this series a couple times before, but this follows a young man named Fitz, who is the bastard son of king-in-waiting Prince Chivalry. Now when Fitz is dropped off at the steps of the palace, Prince Chivalry abdicates the throne in shame and moves off to the countryside. However, Fitz is still left to be raised by those at court, surrounded by this family and these politics that he's never really known or understood. Because Fitz is a bastard, he has enough political influence to potentially be a problem for the royal family, and as such, King Shrewd decides that he should become the royal assassin. And this series follows Fitz from age 6 till he's essentially an old man, but in this book it follows him at around age 15 and 16. I really loved this one. I felt like I was more attached to the characters in Royal Assassin than I was in Assassin's Apprentice. It's the same cast of characters generally, like a couple new people are added, but generally speaking you're following the same people. I just felt so much more connected to them in this one. It was a very slow thing. I didn't notice how much I was starting to care about Fitz until horrible things kept happening to him and I was getting more and more upset. I also think one of the greatest strengths of this book is the politics. It's so intricate and interesting. There's this whole web going on that is so interesting to unravel throughout the course of the book and kind of try to figure out the bigger forces at play. And while this is a very slow-moving fantasy, which you'd think would be a pretty big negative considering it's almost 700 pages long, I was never bored and I felt myself completely sucked into this. It did take me a while to read, but I enjoyed the experience the entire time. I felt like I was completely sucked into the atmosphere of this world. Robin Hobb's writing style is so engrossing and engaging, and it's so good at building the atmosphere and the world building. So the plot in this was interesting. I did like it, but I felt like it was maybe a little bit more obvious or just not quite as intriguing as the plot of the first book was, which I think detracted from it, but I think every other aspect of Royal Assassin was as good, if not better, than Assassin's Apprentice, which is why I can't decide if I want to give it 4.5 and make it lower than the first one, or 5 and put it on par. Something else about the series that I want to note is generally when I give books 5 stars, it's because I'm so excited, I'm just overwhelmed with feelings, I have to talk about it. And that's not how I feel about these. These are, again, very like a slow burn thing, and I don't notice how invested I am until it's over. But these are just so technically solid that I can't find a lot of faults with them. They're just very good and they deserve 5 stars. I really enjoyed the first 2 entries in the series, and I'm excited to finish up the first trilogy in August with Assassin's Quest. Alright, that's all the books I managed to read in July. Again, it was a really good reading month for me in terms of quality, and it was pretty good in quantity. I'd been in a reading slump for a couple of months before that, and we kind of picked back up, and I'm excited to keep this momentum going into August. But that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you liked this video. If you want to keep up with what I'm reading, I have a link to my Goodreads in the description below. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time.